Today, I am joined by the executive director of National Black Justice Coalition. That's a civil rights organization dedicated to the empowerment of the Black LGBTQIA plus community. David Johns, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Adrian.
Yes, David, these are very unfortunate circumstances in terms of the conversation we're going to have today, but it is something that's very much a reality and going down, particularly in Florida. Right now with that Parental Rights and Education Act, which critics largely have dubbed the Don't Say Gay bill, we've been seeing topics of discussion essentially being around what children should be able to talk about in the educational environment, but also people aren't necessarily fully clear on what this bill is about. So can you educate them?
Yes, I can, and I again appreciate you for making space for this important conversation. I first want people to know that I come to this conversation as an elementary school educator. I taught kindergarten and third grade, and I think often about the challenges that children who don't perform gender identity in the way in which adults expect them to, or who show up in ways that are queer, are LGBTQIA+, they face additional challenges right now that have been exacerbated by the introduction of bills like the Don't Say Gay Act in Florida, or the more than 200 bills that have been introduced in the last 2 years, right? And so at this point, we know that what happens in Florida is important because as goes Florida, so goes the rest of the country. And there are attempts right now to limit the ability for educators to allow students to have conversations affirming their same gender loving families, our parents. It encourages surveillance by way of having adults report on others. And while we're talking about Florida, we should also mention that there are similar bills in Texas that incentivize the reporting of parents who provide affirming care for their children. And so there's a lot of danger in even the discussion of these bills. There are harms that we've already seen in children talking about the response to them. And our children, all of whom have not asked to be born, really deserve much better.
Yeah, without a doubt, these children definitely do deserve better. And I know a lot of people out there who do support this Don't Say Gay bill. They're claiming that this is going to give parents greater control over their children's education, really reinforcing these notions of parental authority. And we saw this kind of similar approach by Florida when it came to purported critical race theory and teaching anything about race really in schools. So I'm just wondering, as an educator yourself, why do you think that these parents, or at least that these members of legislature, are suddenly so interested in children's education?
Yeah, the direct answer to the question is that this is political theater at its lowest. And politicians who are supporting white supremacy are really fearful of the growing diversity that exists in schools throughout this country, as well as in communities throughout this country. These are attempts to suppress critical thinking. They're attempts to deny us opportunities to talk about fact-based truths. And they will continue to have damaging impact in terms of tearing apart communities and ultimately affecting our country. One of the things that incenses me most when thinking about the Stop Woke Act, which you referenced, which has its sights on critical race theory, is that people have misperceptions of what most people access by going to law school. Are people pursuing PhDs, as am I, used as a theoretical construct to make sense of how we all show up in this social world. And that there are people right now who are logical thinking and have the ability to look things up in books and using the internet, who are calling truths and histories critical race theory, is already indicative of the problems that we're facing.
Absolutely. And seeing this Don't Say Gay bill advance and move forward, it's scary because it just really says what they're willing to do for this political theater. And as we just saw it essentially be done when it came to race and really just talking about history that doesn't favor white supremacy. So back to the bill here. So when it comes to the Don't Say Gay bill, it was pretty remarkable and somewhat shocking that President Joe Biden even said something about it, essentially using his megaphone from the White House to speak out against the bill and its sponsors. But as you noted, there are so many bills out there like this. I believe there are nearly 200 anti-LGBTQ bills essentially across the nation right now that are targeting children in some way. So what more should the White House do?
Yeah, more than 60 million children in 42 states throughout this country are affected by the bills that we're discussing. Those that encourage censorship by way of access to books, our conversation, or that target LGBTQIA plus or otherwise stigmatized and minoritized students. And I want everyone to understand that even the discussion of this legislation is having an effect upon our children. We've seen increase in suicide rates and other indicators of mental health distress and trauma. And we should be mindful of that at present. Directly to your question about what can be done at the federal level, there can be more investments in the provision of mental health support to ensure that our babies have access to resources to ensure that they are well. Organizations like the National Education Association, the American Federation for Teachers, school leaders can partner with organizations like NBJC and GLSEN as well to find ways to continue to have thoughtful conversations that celebrate the diversity that has always existed and allow all of our students to feel safe and supported as members of our school communities. I also want to name that it is critically important to celebrate that parents are a child's first and most important educator. And at no point should they ever abdicate the opportunity and really responsibility they have to talk to their children about the important truths that have allowed us to come to the point where we are at present. And so there's something that each of us can do at this moment, including assuring that political bullies don't have opportunities to target our children in the future.
Absolutely. These political bullies using their power to essentially limit people's lives in a way that seems to encroach on civil rights, as you mentioned there in Texas, where you have individuals working pretty much overtime to silence individuals and also targeting trans children. How is this impacting the Black community specifically now, given that you are the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition?
Yeah, I appreciate the question and always think it important today that we're not a monolith. And when we think about the ways in which white supremacy and anti-Blackness impact Black people generally, we know that there's a disproportionate impact for those of us that have multiple stigmatized, minoritized identities. And so children who identify as members of the LGBTQIA plus community, as well as children who are most often assumed to be members of the LGBTQIA plus communities, face high rates of mental distress and are more likely to be pushed out of schools and the spaces that they're required to move through in order to be successful in our country and in life more generally.
Yes, and I'd imagine that that is something that can be very devastating. I believe you had mentioned suicide rates spiking.
Yeah, we worked with the National Black Justice Coalition, worked with the Congressional Black Caucus before the pandemic to ring the alarm and to highlight that the suicide rates amongst Black children and youth have doubled in the last 2 decades, which is a problem, again, given that children don't ask to be born or consent to the problems that adults have created. And those suicide rates have decreased for every other community of children. And so what we know also based on data collected by the Trevor Project and our partners at GLSEN is that children, again, who are assumed to be LGBTQIA+, find both schools and communities to be hostile and unsafe spaces. And so the combination of those two things, again, in a political environment where you also have the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, a Black man standing in a Black church calling LGBTQIA+ children trash, is that they often find the spaces they're forced to move through by law to be toxic. And what we know is that when children are in toxic environments, it's really difficult for them to be well.
Absolutely, and it is kind of almost all seems to be in one fell swoop in terms of the way our nation treats its children, as we saw with gun violence in schools, in terms of mass shootings and things not being done to curb that. It just seems that they want to do all they can to keep children from learning, and we need to give children environments in which they can blossom and bloom, especially since there are future generations and they will be our leaders someday. And in terms of the work that you do, what would you say as the next steps?
There are at least 3 next steps. One is to love on the babies that exist in the world who didn't ask to be born. Asa Hilliard talks about never having met a child who wasn't a genius. And there not being a secret to how we support them. We first acknowledge them as human, and we second support them with love. The second thing related to that for me is ensuring that love looks like connecting them to mental health supports and fighting against policies that don't allow them to show up and show out in all of their fullness. The third thing that I would encourage people to do is connect with NBJC to find ways to get into the arena with us as we continue to fight this regressive legislation in states like Texas, Florida, and North Carolina. And as we also advance progressive pieces of legislation to ensure that all of our babies have the opportunity to thrive.
Yes, ensuring that all children have opportunities to thrive is so incredibly important, as well as walking away from this cis heteronormative nonsense that has us being faux puritanical idiots. But I guess that's a diatribe I'll go off on another day. It's a problem.
Do it today. That's yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wish we could. We don't have the time though, but I know I do got a few things to say about that. But I really appreciate you joining us. And can you please tell our viewers where they can find out more information about you yourself, Mr. Johns, and also your organization?
Yes, Adrian, thankful to you for providing this space and for your work more generally. The National Black Justice Coalition exists at nbjc.org, and we're NBJC on the move across digital platforms.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. That's David Johns, Executive Director of National Black Justice Coalition. We very, very much appreciate you being here to speak on this issue, elevating it, and also for all the good work that you do in making this world a better place.